Okay, starting part 2 of chapter 25 for our Latin 3 students. Hopefully you've spent some time practicing how to form your infinitives. I'm going to move into how infinitives are used in Latin. So let me move over here to share my screen with you guys. Let's pull that back up here. All right, so there's our infinitive chart that we've just worked on. That's what it looks like for all 5 conjugations. Let's go ahead and go into presentation mode here and check this out here. So how are infinitives used in sentences? So this is what we're used to so far. Infinitive can be used like a noun. It can be used as a direct object. It can be used as a subject of a sentence. Let's look at this first example as an infinitive being used as a subject. Errare est humanum. Errare obviously is the active present infinitive for erro, errare. So to err is human, is the translation here. So to err is the infinitive, it's the subject. It is human. Here's a second way that we've already learned how infinitives can be used, a complementary infinitive. We've often talked about debeo, possum. Those are verbs that need a complementary infinitive to complete the thought. Audeo for A-U-D-E-O. Audeo, audere means to dare. Those require an infinitive to complete the thought. You ought to study your homework. You ought to clean your room, or I am able to run. I dare to think. So those are examples. Let's look at a Latin example here. Discedere nunc possunt. Discedere, obviously the present active infinitive. Nunc possunt. Nunc possunt is they were now able, discedere, to leave. Discedere is completing the thought. If you didn't have it, you would simply have they were now able. It's an incomplete thought. So discedere completes it. It's a complementary infinitive. The third form, which we actually haven't learned yet, and we're going to learn later if we get to it this semester, but it can be used as a direct object, and it'll be in the accusative. I'm just going to bypass this for time's sake, and we're going to go straight to the fourth one, which is what this chapter is about. It's used as in an indirect statement format. This is the most common usage of infinitives. So let's look more closely at an example here. All right. So what's the difference? What's the difference between an indirect statement and a direct statement? That's probably the question you want to know. What's the difference between what's a direct statement? What's an indirect statement? Because infinitives are used to form indirect statements. So let's talk about what a direct statement is first. A direct statement is a statement made directly from a person. For example, Julia is a good student. I'm directly saying that. Julia is a good student. Or you could even say it this way. The teacher said Julia is a good student. Either way, it is directly being reported what was being said. Julia is a good student, or the teacher said, quote, Julia is a good student. That's a direct statement. Those are direct statements. But that's different than an indirect statement, which is what this chapter is all about. So let's look at what the definition of, let's look at Latin first, sorry. Julia est bona discipula. Julia is a good student. And then the Latin for that second one, magister inquit. Julia est bona discipula. The teacher said, Julia is a good student. So those are direct statements. Let's look at indirect statements. Here it is. An indirect statement is a statement made indirectly from a person. So what does that look like? Here it is. Julia is a good student. Looks like I did not correct. That is anticlimactic. I did not put the Latin on here. So let's look at your book. I apologize that I copied and pasted it and changed it. So look at your book at the bottom of page 201. I apologize for that. It's actually at the bottom of page, top of page 203. Let's do it that way. I apologize. The teacher says that Julia is a good student. Notice I'm reporting what somebody else has said, but it's not a direct quote. It's indirectly saying it. The teacher says that Julia is a good student. All right. In Latin, here's what that would look like. Look just below that. Magister dixit Juliam esse discipulam bonam. The teacher says, that's the first part. Matter of fact, if you cover it up, The rest of that, you have the main sentence there, Magister Dixit. That's the main sentence. The teacher says. The teacher says what? The teacher says, Julia, right? Julia is a good student. Now notice you have the infinitive. If you were to translate this literally, it says, the teacher says Julia to be a good student. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So in English, you take the infinitive and you translate it like it's in the present or perfect or future tense, depending on which form of the infinitive you have. In this case, esse is simply the present tense infinitive to be, so you translate it is. The teacher says Julia is a good student. Now in Latin, we back up. In English, we add the word that. So really the best translation here is the teacher says that Julia is a good student. So in English, you add that. It's not in the Latin. There's no that. In Latin, you add it. And that's the best way to explain the indirect statement. So let's look at a couple examples here. I'm gonna help you out here. All right, here's some things you need to know about the indirect statement. There are three things you need to have for an indirect statement to be an indirect statement. The first is you have to have the main verb is what we call a head verb. It's a verb of some sort of mental activity, like thinking. All of a sudden, I'm mind blanking. It's on the, by the way, if you want to look on the bottom of page 205, there's a whole list of what we call head verbs. Saying, knowing, thinking, perceiving, feeling. All of those are what we call head verbs. It's not an action. It's something that happens in here. And so you have to have that main verb be a head verb. The second thing you have to have is that you have a subject of that dependent clause. It's in the accusative, not the nominative, and that's something that we're not used to. Subject should be nominative. Look at that example on page 203 we just looked at. Juliam, am, that's accusative, but it's the subject of the verb, the linking verb esse. So it's a subject, but it's in the accusative. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but you got to have that for the indirect statement. And the third thing is you got to have an infinitive. No infinitive, no indirect statement. So these three things you have to have: a head verb, subject that's in the accusative, the secondary subject of the secondary clause, not the main subject, and then you have an infinitive in that secondary clause. So let's go on to the next slide here. Translating, or actually the second half of this slide. How do you translate an indirect statement? Now you're going to have to focus with me, okay? Everybody focus here. Here's how you translate an indirect statement. First off, you have to add the word that after the main verb and before your accusative subject, okay? You have to add the word that in English. Secondly, you've got to translate the infinitive like it's an indicative verb. So like that esse we just looked at, you didn't translate it as to be, you translated it as is. Now here's what's important to notice. You have to translate that secondary verb, that infinitive verb, the tense, relative to the action of the main verb. We've already talked about this before in class. Let me illustrate this. Look back on page 203. This will perfectly illustrate this. Look at that example. Magister dixit uliam esse discipulam bonum. That's one sentence. The next sentence is almost exactly like it. Magister dixit. So the main verb is a different tense. Uliam esse discipulam bonum. What's the difference? Well, the first sentence, the main verb is present tense. Dixit. The teacher says. The second sentence, Magister dixit, says, translates the teacher said. It's perfect tense. So the first example, you have the teacher says. The second example, you have the teacher said. Present tense, perfect tense. Now, if you look, the secondary verb, the infinitive, both of them are esse. They're both present, active infinitives. So you would think you translate that the exact same way, but you don't. You translate the second verb, the infinitive, in relationship to the tense of the main verb. So we've got this little chart here. I'm going to go ahead and show it to you here. We've already talked about this in class. If the main verb, if the subordinate verb is in the present tense, then the action is taking place at the exact same time as the main verb. It doesn't matter if the main verb is in the present, the past, or the future. if your subordinate verb is in the present tense, it's happening at the same time as the main verb, okay? So if the main verb is perfect tense, then even if your infinitive is in the present tense, you translate it at the same time, it's also in the perfect, the past tense. If your main verb is in the future, then your secondary verb, even though it's in the present tense, you translate it as if it's in the future tense. What about the perfect tense? If your secondary verb is in the perfect tense, then the relationship to the main verb is that it precedes it. It's acting before the main verb. And then lastly, the future tense, if it's the main verb is, the secondary verb is in the future tense, it's happening after the main action, the action of the main verb. So what does that look like? Well, we've got a little chart here to help us out here, right? And stay with me here. This will make sense if we work it through here. So if your main verb is in the present tense, for example, dick und, they say, that's present tense. They say, they are saying. Your main verb is they say. Okay, let's look at the first example. If it's the subordinate verb is in the present tense, so let's give us an example. Uare, excuse me. Eare, So notice eare is infinitive. It's the active present tense. So it's present tense. So it's happening at the same time as the action of the main verb. The main verb is present tense. So this will also be translated as if it's present tense. They say that, because we have to add the word that, he is helping, right? Eum is the subject, so it's he. He, eari, we won't say to help, because we're going to translate as indicative. He is helping her. They say that he is helping her. So main verb is present tense. The secondary verb is present tense. So all of it's in the present tense. Let's look what happens if we change that subordinate verb, the infinitive, to the perfect tense. Look what it says here. Uwisse. So notice iuvisse is the perfect infinitive. Excuse me. Perfect infinitive, right? Perfect passive. And it says, I'm sorry, I catch myself. It's the active perfect. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about something else off camera here. It's the active perfect infinitive. So at umawisi they say that he, because it's in the perfect tense, it's happening before the action of the main verb. It's preceding it. So you have to say he helped or was helping her. They say that he helped her. They say that he was helping her. In the future tense, all right, let's see what happens when we change that infinitive future active. They say, iwiti orum, notice that's the future, that's the future active infinitive. They say that he will help her. It's happening after the main verb, so it's going to be future tense, that he will help her. Hope you track with me. Well, let's compare that. What happens if we put the main verb in the perfect tense? So let's change the main verb and see what that looks like. We're going to use the exact same examples. Dix erunt. So now we're using perfect tense. They said. This is happening in the past. Well, what did they say? Let's go with the subordinate verb in the present tense and see what happens. Again, it's the exact same. Notice we're using the exact same thing as the examples above. Ewari, So even though this infinitive is present tense, it means it's happening at the same time as the main verb. The main verb, however, now is in the past. They said. So therefore, it has to be also in the past. They said that he was helping her. Notice, I'm gonna go into the editing mode so you can see this here. Notice that this verb is the same as this verb, but we don't translate this as present, even though it's present. Up here we did, is helping, but here we're translating it as the past tense. And the reason why is because it's happening at the same time as the main verb. They said that he was helping her. What about if this secondary verb infinitive is in the perfect tense? They said, perfect tense means it's happening before the action of the main verb. So what's before the past? Well, that's the pluperfect. So if you remember pluperfect, we have to add a had. So they said that he had helped her. And I left out the word her. Let me go ahead and add that right now. That'll bother me if I don't. There we go. Her. There we go. They said that he had helped her. What about future active? To arum. So it's going to happen after. Future tense happens after the main verb. The main verb is in the past. Can you change this here to that he would help her? They said that he would help her. Now let's look at the last section again. We're going to finish here, and I'll do a third section to help you guys out. Dicent, they will say. So now we've changed the main verb to future tense. So future tense, the present tense infinitive is going to be translated at the same time. They will say that he is helping her. Okay, that's present tense. It's happening at the same time. Perfect tense, it's happening before that. They will say that he helped or was helping her. And then lastly, in the future itoramesi, they will say that he will help her. Notice that this translation is the exact same up here. If your main verb is in the present tense or the future tense, these translations will be the same. It's the perfect that really changes how it should be translated. So I want you guys to practice with that. Practice with the, let me go to the next slide here, make sure that's all I want to look at. Let's see here. Yeah, we're going to look at that in a little bit later in the next video. But practice this on the self-tutorial exercises. Practice how to translate these. Get this in your head. This is the main thing, is that you translate this infinitive secondary verb there in relationship to the tense of the main verb. All right, I'm going to stop recording now, let you guys take a break and do some practice, and get back with me later on this third video. Where do I stop recording? I lost my little button to hit stop. I know you're probably laughing at me, but where did the stop go? Maybe if I put in meeting, that'll stop recording.